The Russia-Ukraine war has left its first year behind. When we looked at the one-year period in general, we see that the Russian army is getting exhausted day by day. There are many reasons for this depletion. Sanctions by Western and European countries, lack of military personnel and equipment, and inexperienced soldiers are some of these problems. But one of the most important developments affecting the depletion of the Russian army is the surrender of Russian soldiers to Ukrainian troops. Because most of the Russian soldiers are forcibly kept in the occupied territories. The soldiers who do not want to die for Putin's political interests surrender to the Ukrainian troops at the first opportunity they find. In the first year of the war, thousands of soldiers surrendered to the Ukrainian army. The number of soldiers surrendering continues to increase every day. Russia's soldiers who do not support Putin's decision to invade are looking for ways to get rid of the occupying Russian army, so much so that tens of thousands of Russian soldiers have posted videos on their social media accounts from the first day of the invasion of Ukraine until today that they do not want to fight. The soldiers in these videos talked about the inhumane actions of the Russian army and their forced conscription. These confessions mobilized the Ukrainian army. It was necessary to help the soldiers who disagreed with Putin's idea of invasion and were looking for ways to leave the front line. Ukraine developed a project for Russian soldiers to surrender to the Ukrainian army. This project was called I Want to Live. Thousands of Russian soldiers surrendered to Ukrainian troops through the I Want to Live project. Before analyzing the details of the I Want to Live project developed by Ukrainian software developers and the striking statements of the surrendered soldiers, we continue to report all developments regarding the Russia-Ukraine war. You can contribute by clicking the Super Thanks button to support our teammates and the content we create with our understanding of accurate and impartial journalism. Let's examine the details of the I Want to Live project together. The I Want to Live project, which allows Russian soldiers who are forcibly kept at the front to surrender to Ukrainian troops, consists of a website, phone and app. Soldiers who want to leave the front line but are unable to do so can easily communicate with Ukrainian troops. Thanks to this application, Ukrainian army first receives some information from the Russian soldiers who contact them. After receiving their information, Russian soldiers must fulfill the conditions requested from them. Russian soldiers are first asked to cross into Ukrainian territory. The I Want to Live teams who reach the location of the Russian soldier who crossed into Ukrainian territory ask the soldiers who will surrender to put down their weapons and to raise their hands in the air. When these conditions are met, a mini drone is sent to the area where the soldiers who want to surrender is located. The soldier is asked to follow the drone. This whole process is monitored by the cameras on the drone. Soldiers who meet the conditions and follow the drone reach the area where the I Want to Live teams are located. Russian soldiers surrendered to Ukrainian troops and are sent to a safe zone. Vitaly Matvienko, spokesperson for the Department of Prisoners of War and the I Want to Live project, made statements about the purpose of the project. Medvedko said that the I Want to Live project will save the lives of Russian soldiers who do not support the occupation of Ukraine. He said that thanks to this project, Russian soldiers can easily surrender to Ukrainian troops, thus reducing the number of invaders on the front line. The I Want to Live project was launched in September 2022. This is the date of the Russian leader Vladimir Putin's partial mobilization. Young people and Russian anti-occupation soldiers in the army, as well as the relatives who do not want to be forced to go to the front by the mobilization order, contacted the I Want to Live project teams. Local newspapers reported that millions of Russians called the I Want to Live hotline. Andrea, a spokesman for the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, said that the number of those who called the project teams received information and surrendered soldiers is increasing every day. And he said that anyone can call this hotline and get information. It was a very important development that the I Want to Live surrender hotline appealed to everyone except the frontline soldiers because the Russian people were uncomfortable with their own own relatives dying for Putin's personal career. By reaching the surrender line, these people could easily receive their relatives who were on the front line. One wonders how many Russian soldiers surrendered to Ukrainian troops thanks to this project. Although Vitaly Matvienko, the spokesperson of the Department of Prisoners of War and the I Want to Live project, did not make a statement on this issue. It is claimed that about 7,000 Russian soldiers surrendered to Ukraine until January 2023. What is the reason for the surrender of Russian soldiers to Ukrainian troops and the increasing number of surrendered soldiers? Let's examine the reasons for this situation together. The biggest reason for the surrender of Russian soldiers to Ukrainian troops is undoubtedly that Putin does not support the idea of invasion. Even though these soldiers are against the idea of Russian leader Vladimir Putin, they were recruited through forced mobilization, having no combat experience and unable to make sense of the situation that they are in. They plan to leave the front line at the first opportunity because these young people have witnessed inexperience and many inhumane events in the army. The Russian youth who surrendered to the Ukrainian troops conveyed the situation they experienced in the Russian army to the whole of the world through the messages they published. For example, a Russian soldier who did not want his name to be disclosed stated that he was sent to the occupation zone by being tricked. He was told that there were drills and training, but the Russian soldier suddenly found himself on Ukrainian soil. This statement shows that Russian leader Vladimir Putin is sending Russian soldiers to their death. Another soldier who surrendered to Ukrainian troops spoke about the inexperience of the commanders at the front. Many of the commanders have never fought in a war before, and no one knew each other at the front. Another soldier explained that they didn't even know who they were fighting. The soldier was one of the prisoners that the Wagner group had promised the prisoners in prison that if they fought for 6 months, they would be free. Coming from prison to the front line, the prisoner thought he was fighting Western countries because the commanders had told him that Western countries were involved in the war in Ukraine. But this was a big lie. A soldier who surrendered to Ukrainian troops with the I Want to Live project said that he surrendered because of the confusion within the Russian army. The army included the Russian State Army, Wagner Group, soldiers and Chechen soldiers. According to the surrendered soldier, there was a constant fight between these groups. The Wagner Group soldiers did not listen to the commanders of the Russian State Army. Chechen soldiers loyal to Kadyrov, who were fighting for Russia, were constantly humiliated because of their race and beliefs. The surrendered soldier explained that along with these problems, the Russian commanders did not value their soldiers and that they were used as cannon fodder in the war. Thousands of soldiers who were forcibly recruited into the army and witnessed these disturbances within the army surrendered to the Ukrainian army. The surrendered soldiers announced on their social media accounts that the Ukrainian army treated them very well. Putin, who has a soldier problem, is losing his soldiers one by one. Having lost approximately 10,000 soldiers to Ukrainian troops within 1 year, it is wondered what Putin will do in the coming days. What do you think about the I Want to Live project? Will the surrender of Russian soldiers to Ukrainian troops through this project affect the course of the war? Will Putin be able to solve the problems in the Russian army? Ukrainian forces are putting up a great resistance against the Russian army in Barentsovo while the Russian forces were attacking with all their might. They also started to deploy their elite soldiers to the region for the spring months. However, Ukrainian forces continue to increase defensive measures so that the attacks of the Russian army do not reach their goal. In this legendary war, Ukrainian forces made a move that the Wagner mercenaries of the Russian army could never have predicted and trapped them. Ukrainian forces use Ukraine's geographical topography to their advantage. How Ukrainian forces stuck Wagner mercenaries on the line of death. Let's examine in detail how the Ukrainian forces intercepted the Wagner mercenaries fighting for the Russian army in the direction of Bakhmut. The land of Ukraine is full of hills, steppes, harsh forests, raging rivers, and bridges connecting them. Bridges are strategically key elements for many purposes. They can be used for both defensive and offensive purposes. At the same time, since bridges are the only and shortest way, this predictably makes bridges primary targets, although strategic. So what if the bridges on the Bakhmut front collapsed on the Russian forces? Victory for the Ukrainian forces has become a habit now, especially in the Bakhmut region. The Ukrainians carry out tactical attacks in order to take advantage of the Russian forces. With these attacks, the Ukrainian forces managed to hold Bakhmut until now. Vladimir Putin, who wanted to take control of the Bakhmut region, started to move a large number of elite Russian soldiers to the region with the approach of spring. The arrival of elite Russian soldiers in Bakhmut may further strain the defense of the Ukrainian forces. However, the Ukrainian commanders are making all the necessary moves to solve this problem. Ukrainian warriors achieved an important victory in a huge battlefield. However, military officials are cautious that they are still vulnerable to Russian attacks from other directions. Ukrainian forces prepared many buildings for war in the Bakhmut region, able to open fire from fortified buildings. Ukrainian warriors have made this critical area killing zone. This would likely make it very difficult for Wagner's forces to attempt to continue their frontal assault in this direction, or Wagner forces will continue their attacks, risking huge losses. This move doesn't make sense, but Russian forces made very few sensible decisions throughout the war. After firing from the killing zone, Ukrainian fighters destroyed important bridges in the Bakhmut area and cut off the offensive route of the Wagner mercenaries. This dealt a major blow to Vladimir Putin's goal of Bakhmut in its latest intelligence update. The UK Ministry of Defense stated that in recent days, Wagner Group forces have captured most neighborhoods in the eastern part of the Donbass town of Bakhmut. The UK Defense Ministry has stated that the Bakhmut River in the city center, which gives the city of Bakhmut its name, is now the front line between Ukrainian and Russian forces. Ukrainian forces control the western part of the city of Bakhmut and have destroyed important bridges over the river, which runs north-south from a 200 to 800 meter wide strip of open space between areas with civilian housing. Ukrainian forces removed the bridges, making it difficult for Russian forces to launch an offensive. However, Russian forces regained control of several key points on the outskirts of Bakhmut. Ukrainian forces took a significant advantage by launching multiple attacks on Russian supply lines. This tactic helped Ukrainian forces regain control of many areas. Now, Russian forces can attack the supply lines of Ukrainian forces west of Bakhmut from their temporarily occupied points on the outskirts of Bakhmut. Supply routes in the west are considered vulnerable by Ukrainian commanders. For this reason, the Ukrainian commanders are on the alert for possible attacks by Russian forces from the north and south, while devising new tactics to protect the supply routes. At the moment, the Ukrainian forces are carrying out heavy attacks on the Russian forces in these regions so that the Russian forces do not attack from the north and south of the supply routes. The attacks of the Ukrainian forces prevent the Russian army from moving from the defensive position to the offensive position. While fierce clashes and tactical wars continue in Bakhmut, the most curious subject is how the spring months will pass in Bakhmut and its outskirts. Let's take a look at how the Russian and Ukrainian forces are preparing for the spring offensive. Working hard day and night with our expert staff, we strive to deliver warm information and special analysis from the front to you as quickly as possible. You can support us with the super thanks button below. The expectations of both sides regarding the spring offensive, which we think will be the biggest war we have ever seen, are very high. While the Russian forces want to capture Bakhmut and advance towards Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, the Ukrainian forces drive out the Russian forces and want the Ukrainian lands to be completely liberated. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is deploying his best troops in Bakhmut to achieve his goal. This military activity will be completed before the spring, and the Russian forces will launch an all-out attack in the direction of Bakhmut when the weather conditions become favorable. However, in recent days, several failed attacks by Russian forces have weakened them and given the Ukrainian forces time to strengthen. The Russian forces suffered heavy losses, and the Ukrainians largely achieved their target in Bakhmut and greatly consolidated their fortifications in the region. If Russia sends its elite troops to Bakhmut in an impromptu manner, Ukrainian forces will be able to neutralize more skilled Russian soldiers. This will cause the Russian forces to weaken more rapidly. About this situation, the Kiev government made the grim assessment that continuing could see Russia's losses far outweigh its own. In order to inflict maximum damage to the Russian forces, the Ukrainian forces will fight to the end. In the city of Bakhmut, where Russia has begun to place its best troops ahead of Ukraine's planned spring offensive. Recently, the Kiev government stated that they had received their receivables in Bakhmut and that there was a tactical possibility of withdrawing from the city. But the Kiev government seems to have backed out, with a combination of Russian troops and mercenaries operated by the private Russian Wagner group shifted to Bakhmut, desperately trying to achieve their first victory. Months later, the Russian forces changed tactics by deploying large numbers of elite soldiers to the region. The Kiev government was convinced that keeping Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut would result in more casualties for Russian forces. Mikhailo Podolyak, an aide to Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, stated that the Russians changed tactics. Podolyak pointed out that the Russians united in Bakhmut with the bulk of their trained military personnel, the remnants of their professional army, and private companies. According to Podolyak's statements, the Ukrainian forces have two new targets. The first is to reduce the capable personnel of the Russian forces as much as possible and to stabilize them in several important grueling battles disrupting their offensive. The other is to concentrate Ukrainian resources elsewhere for the spring counter-offensive. We would like to remind you that recently it was stated that Bakhmut did not have a critical structure, and what made it critical was that the leaders put pressure on Bakhmut. However, with the Russian forces changing tactics, Bakhmut reached a much more strategic position for the war. The decision of the Kremlin government to send hundreds of thousands of regular soldiers, reserve officers, and mercenaries to Bakhmut will cause the most violent clashes of the war. Moscow points out that capturing Bakhmut will open a hole in Ukraine's defense and will be an important step towards a big target of capturing the entire Donbass industrial zone of Ukraine. Russian forces are trying to gain an advantage in the eastern part of Bakhmut and the suburbs to the north and south. However, the Ukrainian forces are quite determined not to allow this. Deputy Defense Minister Anna Malyar stated that while Russia continues its offensive, Ukrainian soldiers are doing everything possible to prevent the Russians from carrying out their plans. The fact that the Russian forces deployed more trained soldiers in the Bakhmut region, where there has been great activity in recent days, and that the Ukrainian forces abandoned their withdrawal plans indicates that we are approaching a great breaking point for the war. Whichever side wins as a result of this breaking moment will result in a serious collapse for the other side. The Ukrainian forces can easily come out of this collapse by holding on to their long-time victories. But we can say that the end has begun for the Russian forces and the Kremlin government. In the Luhansk region, there were a lot of unexpected developments. The Ukrainians seem to have overstretched themselves by trying to storm too many settlements simultaneously, which created a weak link. The Russians managed to identify the fact that the Ukrainians were short on resources. They launched a counterattack and in several days managed to push the Ukrainians out of one settlement. However, once the Ukrainians finished their operation near Karlivka, they conducted a real counterattack and changed the situation dramatically. And here is how last time I told you that the Russians in Kazivka found themselves in a very bad position because the Ukrainians managed to establish control over two crucial positions that allowed them to storm Kazivka virtually with impunity. To understand why it is so, let's look at the terrain. Given that the Russians control Kazivka and Krivosheevo, it means that the Russians hold very strong control over the density areas and belts between these two settlements. So attacking Kazivka is only possible from the northwest. However, if you look at the topographic map, we can see that in order to launch this attack, the Ukrainians must control the two high ground positions Novosergeyevsky and the forest. As long as the Russians control at least one of these positions, they can counter any attack on Kazivka and continue to hold the line. Unfortunately for the Russians, after the fierce forest battle, the Ukrainians managed to establish control over the second position. So the Russians in Kazivka became at a complete tactical disadvantage. That is why the moment the Ukrainians took the forest, the Russians launched a desperate attack on the Vasilevsky. Attacking the Vasilevsky from Kazivka is a very difficult job, and none of their previous operations were successful. But this time they had no other choice, so they continued to push irrespective of the losses. In a few days they established a toehold and then gradually pushed the Ukrainians out of this village. The Ukrainians could not reinforce this region adequately because they launched a couple of heavy assaults a bit to the north. So due to the short-term lack of additional resources, the Ukrainians had to step back. The Russians tried to keep up the momentum and even started developing their offensive in the direction of Barentsovo. In order to make it possible, they shall still have heavily to fix Ukrainian troops and then assaulted Barentsovo. This started to become very dangerous because any Russian success in Barentsovo would completely annihilate Ukrainian success in the forest. Fortunately, the Ukrainians in Barentsovo had enough forces and also solid defense. The quality of their defense is not surprising because Barentsovo had been the target of assaults for a very long time until the Ukrainians had taken over Zalivskoho. These events near Kazivka mirrored what was happening to them a little bit to the north. As you remember, the Ukrainians finally established control over the Kozlovka group and even started advancing towards Volodymyrivka. So the Ukrainians were cutting into the Russian defense to the north while the Russians were cutting into the Ukrainian defense to the south. However, Russian successes did not last for long. After the Ukrainians finally established control over the Kozlovka group, they relieved some of their troops, which were sent to Barentsovo, where the Ukrainians immediately launched their counterattack. By leveraging their tactical advantage in the region, the Ukrainians attacked Novoselivka, established partial control with no big hurdles, and then slowly pushed the Russians back to Kazivka. As of now, based on the reports of the Ukrainian General Staff, it looks like the Russians are still trying to push and fight back, but with no results. The latest reports suggest that the Ukrainians have also finally broke in through the Russian defenses in Yagodny and established total control over this village. What this means for the Russians in Kozlovka is that now they will find themselves exactly in the same situation as the Ukrainians in Barentsovo recently did. They will not receive a lot of reinforcements because the higher command will be busy trying to stabilize the situation to the north. This should be a perfect opportunity for the Ukrainians to assault Kazivka.